Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and I'm so excited today to be talking all about the Disney Plus series Willow with Amar Chadha-Patel. And I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the boot camp that you essentially had with the rest of the cast before filming. And one of the aspects of that was character development and really talking through scenes and talking through the scripts, which I think is so wonderful that there was that rehearsal and character development time ahead of filming, because it always makes such a difference and isn't always a given in productions. And so I wanted to ask about how that really helped you to add a lot of layers and textures alongside the way that this character is written, because you've talked about this character as kind of being set up at the beginning of the archetype of like, he's the tall guy with a lot of confidence and a sword. But what you do with that character and what the scripts do is really break down that archetype into a lot of spaces.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's unusual. And I think it was actually essential, that boot camp. Partly because the show itself is a quest show and it's a journey. And it's, despite all of the scale that it seems to have, at its heart, it is just six people moving through a bunch of landscapes and having to deal with each other and everything that flies at them. So the heart of all of this large, glitz and glamour and magic and special effects and fight scenes is just six dysfunctional people. And that was a really important essence to the show that John Kasdan, our creator, and Lucasfilm were quite, adamant that was important. And so I didn't actually do any chemistry reads either when I was auditioning, which is also quite rare, I think, for something like of this scale, especially when I'm going to be working with so many cast for such an extended period of time. So it was kind of a shot in the dark. I got a lot of faith in John Kasdan and the other creative teams. They obviously had a lot of faith in me. But I genuinely didn't know how it was going to go. We all met on Zoom once I was cast and everyone else was cast, and that was great. And we all had chats and we jumped straight into a WhatsApp group and all the traditional stuff that you would do. But I think the first time I actually met a lot of them was the read through for block one, right at the beginning of May. So it was quite intense, but it was like last day of school, but also first day of school thrust together. And then, we went on this journey and we did a month long boot camp of stunt training, horse riding, personal training for a lot of us, and then character research. And it was incredibly important because it just gave us a chance to sort of forge a relationship between us, so that we had this bedrock of closeness. So then we had to weave through these complex emotions, and we weren't nervous with each other, and we had this rapport. So I mean, an essential, and I hope that comes across in the show. I think the chemistry between everyone seems like it's quite fiery and alive.
Yeah. And I mean, your character definitely comes across as someone like he's very street savvy in the world. He's experienced a lot of stuff, for better and for worse. And he's experienced losing people. And so he's got these kind of guards up against getting close to people. And so as you were going through the scripts and looking at the idea of, okay, he's very confident in these ways, like he's a very astute fighter, because he's done this several times before. But what was that journey of working with the scripts and finding all his different fallibilities, because even just the fact that he struggles to emotionally get close to people is one of those, for example.
Yeah, well, I guess the archetype of the tall guy with the sword who makes jokes was what was expected of me, and I knew I could do that. And so when we started breaking the character down, I was starting to get bits of information from John and the other writers about what his journey was. That's when I was able to form who he was going to be, and a lot of the obvious stuff was quite easy to me. And I think it was a question of creating a sort of backstory in my head for Boorman. So I actually bought a big roll of lining paper from B&Q, the stuff that you put up underneath wallpaper, pre-wallpaper you might call it, and I just pushed it out in my flat and then drew a massive timeline, with 0 being season 1 episode 1. And everything progressing was the plot points I knew, and then what I was being fed, because we didn't actually get our scripts that far in advance. We had the first block, and then we would get this, we would get 3 and 4 just a little bit before the read-throughs. And so we weren't really getting the information, but we were getting bits and tidbits from John and other people. So I was adding those, and then back the other way, pre-0, I started adding in things that John had told me, things that I had thought. And so I had this visual thing that I could look at And one of the key things that John first said to me when we were having our initial meetings about the character was that, the really tragic thing about Borman is that he probably wishes he had a really traumatic and character building childhood, but he didn't. He probably just comes from like two really nice parents, and he probably had everything he wanted. And it summed that character up for me, because it was someone who's he's so desperate to be a hero in the traditional sense that you would expect. So he is a lens for how audiences view that character. He comes on screen and everyone's like, that's the guy. He's cool. He's got a sword. He can fight. He's going to be the hero. That's obvious. And so that bit of information, he's kind of meta in that way, because he's never going to be that, really, because we don't need that anymore, especially in this fantasy genre. And so that journey that he goes on, how fallible he becomes and stuff, is down in part to knowing where he was going and how I could inform the performance by making him flawed.
That's so great. And I love the fact that for him, for those fallibilities to open up in him is kind of more of a minute version in different ways. So like for the emotional side of him, there's, I think it's the moment where you're hugging Jade and it's like, his arms aren't really engaged and he doesn't really know what to do with them. And you pat her on the head for a moment because but it's like, even the fact that he is standing there and allowing that to happen is a monumental moment for him as a character, to allow someone that close to him and to physically engage with them. And so how did you find those details of what does this shift and growth look like for him in a character? Because it's not all of a sudden, sitting around the campfire singing songs and telling stories and hugging everybody for him. It's little things like allowing someone to hug them and patting them on the head.
It's funny that, you know what, halfway through shooting, they cut a sizzle reel together for some of the execs and to show what we were doing. And that scene was one that we shot and made it onto the sizzle reel. And it's a different edit from what's in the show. And it's really interesting because the button on that is that he's taken aback and he sort of just goes with it. And he's like, this is how you deal with physical emotion. And it's perfect for that character. But for whatever reason, in this sizzle reel that was actually just for internal use, that moment happens, and he does the awkward look to see if someone has noticed, and then there's this minuscule movement where I actually just lean into it and give Jade this hug back, and I remember watching it with Erin, and both of us like. And we must have done multiple takes, and what was right for the show was the awkwardness and the making that the joke, but there was also this version of it where his this masculine, powerful, guarded energy breaks for a second, and he suddenly takes on this like elder brotherly role, and it was really beautiful, and it showed me how that scene was going to be perceived in various different ways. And I think the interesting thing about Borman is that for a lot of the time I feel like his counterpoint is Jade. And Erin does such an incredible job, and they're really two very similar characters. They're very talented fighters. They're very world smart. They're not from money, really. They're not royalty, and they both have the same obstacles, and they've both done the same things. They both kill people for the sake of preventing their own death. They've done these intense things, but their way of navigating that is totally different. And I think they both sort of resent each other a little bit. Borman probably resents Jade for the amount of respect she has and the fact that she's done things by the book, and she probably resents Borman for being a lot more open. And Erin and I have talked about this in interviews as well, and we're actually two sides of the same coin, and it's a really nice thing to develop. And in terms of picking those moments, I think it's just, for me, I like to read the scripts over and over and over again without focusing on the lines. Just read them and let the story immerse itself, let it percolate through me. And then I will start a lot of physical in terms of my process. I'll start a lot of the physical work of how the character is going to move. And sometimes it's not a big thing. Sometimes it's a small thing. But with Borman, I wanted to give him this like lumbering physicality of him being really big and being physically imposing whenever he's in a space, but then also to add to this like a performative element of him trying to hide himself, but knowing it's a performance. So there's a really small scene in the first episode where we get Alora off this horse because she's been following us, and then she says, "I can cook," and all Borman says is, "Are you any good?" But what I wanted to do was sort of like do this like quite jester like performative dance into the space that was being inhabited by Erin and Ruby and Ellie, and sort of make that move into that scene and that moment a performance. So his like walk in is this like quiet little like it announces himself, and so all that physicality is what I was building in the lead up to shooting, and then the words is just something I learn the day before or on the day, and I think about how they're going to translate into the nuance of the movement. And so with that scene on the battlements, what I knew about that scene was I was going into it confused. I was taking this moment to impart some knowledge, and I felt like that was Boorman feeling like his job had been done. Yeah. And then what I had to do was then be confused by what then happens when what is unexpected. And so knowing my physicality as the character, and then deciding how would I react if that power, that physical power was taken away from me by it's all that kind of nuance is what I like about acting. It's not like, how do you say the lines? It's all of that stuff. And that I think shows his fallibility and all these things is all these like behaviors that are quiet, but also quite big. And yeah.
It doesn't. And speaking of the physicality as well, obviously you also went through a lot of stunt training and weaponry training, and you've done aspects of that in other roles in your career. But I've heard you say that the type of stunt work and the type of training that you had to do was very different from what you've ever done for roles before. So I was interested in what were the aspects that felt very different to you in terms of that realm, because it's also another form of character development going through that sort of training.
And it was so fun. I mean, the main thing was that the casting process was quite intense. It was 6 months, started in October 2020, was cast in March 2021. Ups and downs, lots of meetings. For the main part, I think I was a risk because I was completely unknown, but also I was stick thin. And I needed to be this big, lumbering barbarian. It wasn't like an aesthetic thing in terms of like, attractive. So it was just like the size. I needed to be wide. So I didn't know, I think that John specifically didn't know if he could trust I would be that, but I was like, I'm committed to this. I know I can do this. The physical element is easy as far as learning the part. So I actually had to put on like 15 kilograms of muscle in about 2.5 months. It was like a crazy bulking process. So that was so hard. And I've never done that before for a role. And I always said I'd only ever get muscly and big if someone paid me to do it, and someone did, so I had to commit to that. But it's a very strange process, putting lots of physical work in to change your body to make it bigger and to appear scarier. So that whole process made me appreciate like the nuance in creating physical strength and becoming bigger, like actually just physically becoming bigger helped me inform that character. And then as far as the stunt training and fighting was going, I mean, ultimately we had a month to look like we'd been doing it forever. So it's intensive. And not only do you have to look good at it, you have to learn how to do it without hurting anyone. So you have to be good at hitting, but not actually hitting. And then you have to sort of kind of like a bit like jazz, you sort of learn it and throw it all away and make it your own. And the sword that Boorman has is this cleaver, this ginormous, ridiculous compensation device, which only has a one-sided blade. So one side of it isn't sharp. So it's not like a sword where you can just swing it around and hit. It's only one side of it does damage. The other one's just flat. So I had to learn how to fight like with a bow staff because it was such a long weapon, but also had to learn how to fight using the sword and had my handwork. Because wherever I landed the blow, I would have had to have been able to turn the sword in the direction it was going. So it was all these technical things, which was one thing. And then once I had that, we started designing the fights with CC Smith, our stunt coordinator, who's incredible. And obviously everyone wants to make their fights as cool as possible. And I did, but I also had to feed Boorman into that. And I was like, look, Boorman is this rogue. He's a good fighter, but a big part of his character is that he sort of accidentally gets away with things, and I want to channel that. I want things to happen in the fights that might be an accident, and I want his style to be not disciplined. I want it to be brutish and big, and so some of the hits are big hits. It's quite and I wanted it to be different to what Erin was doing, because Erin is technically incredible and just like destroys people with these amazing, and Boorman's just swinging this thing around like he doesn't know what he's doing. And so I had to sort of create this sort of drunken style of lumbering fighting that was quite messy, and it was really fun. I mean, it's so involved in the point that when we did the first couple of sessions with the sword, I would swing it and then block and then use my arm behind the flat bit of the blade to drive it forward to make these other movements. And I had bruises all the way down my arm. So I went to Sarah Young and Mark, our leatherwork and our costume designer, and said, I need something here. What can we do? So we designed a leather gauntlet with 3 bits of metal built into them, which then acted as a second weapon and something to make the sword play work. And having the freedom to create those little details with a character in us, I mean, that's what makes the thing leap out of the screen to me. So yeah, none of that would have happened if we hadn't had this boot camp and this training and this incredible production that was willing to work with us to build these characters, because those details they just take someone from the page to real life.
That's amazing. And in terms of the dynamic in a lot of the group scenes as well, Borman is very often the comedic relief in a situation. And there's actually so much truthfulness. It feels like there's more truth in his comedic lines than in things that he says when he has time to kind of consider what he's saying and think about it a little bit more. And so how did you find that his comedic sensibility and that style of kind of sarcasm and humor in him was actually also a way to express a lot of truth in a character like him?
Well, I'm British. That helps. Very dry. Very cynical. I mean, and John was also quite explicit from the beginning that Borman was really the sort of lens for the audience to, he's the audience's lens in the show, really. Everyone has their arc, and so does Borman, but his asides are the questions or the statements that the audience should be thinking about all this ridiculous. And as such, the freedom to do that in a fantasy show is so good. It's what I think, everyone gets a chance to do it at points, but Borman is definitely there to fulfill that role. But to be able to do that, to be in this world that is ridiculous and has trolls and magic and stuff, and then have someone fall over and be like, well, you should have put your shoes on, and say the stuff that no one ever says in those things, it's such a joy. And I think, every time Borman gets a one-liner, the real thing about Borman is that he's not funny because he's trying to be funny, he is funny. It's a very fine balance of comedy, and I think someone like Martin McDonagh does it incredibly in Banshees of Inisherin, stuff like that. It's these lines are written to be so funny, and the only job you have is to try and not make them too funny, or not try and perform them as if you're trying to do it for the audience. You're doing it for the world you're in. So you're kind of throwing this stuff away because it's not, you're not projecting it loudly for everyone to hear and clap at. You're sort of saying it because it's what your internal thought is. And it's a fine line to hit. And that was what I would always go into with the humor was, like, what's a way of performing this that doesn't feel like I'm doing it for the audience? Because I think it would be funnier that way.
And going back to something that you were saying earlier about, in his mind, he's going to be the hero. He's going to accomplish everything. And there's a lot of ways in which it feels like he's very much the main character in his own story and his own narrative. And even the scene where he's sitting there regaling a story to Kit, and she literally calls him Borman because he just won't get to the point. And then he still goes back to telling the story in this very over-grandialized way, shows the way that he's kind of centering himself in the narrative as well. And so were there certain choices that you found yourself making based off of that ideology of this is how he sees himself, this is how he perceives himself, and so this is how he moves in the world? I mean, the funny thing about it is that we all really see ourselves as the protagonist of our own story. If you don't, you're an incredibly selfless person, and hats off to you. So in a sense, we're all doing that. And the beauty of this character in this show is that by starting there, that that's not the point. And so those elements of Borman are the performative bits, when he's being funny and cutting is like him just being dry and cynical. But when he's got a chance to peacock, he takes it. So there are times when he peacocks. So the story with Kit is a great example. When he interrupts the fight, when he turns up at the top of episode 3 and it's like tense, and he's like, someone just briefly recap everything I missed. And then he takes that opportunity to do it, knowing that no one needs to do that. That's him
trying to be the cool hero, and no one wants it. It's fun. It's funny. It's not funny because he said it. It's funny because everyone's like, "Oh, this guy." Do you know what I mean? Like, that's the beauty of it. For me to pick the moments that I was going to make performative, and the moments that I was going to do with earnest naturalistic performance, that's, you know, that's how I found that divide. Yeah.
I also love that you're playing this character that in essence doesn't have a fear of life and death, but has a fear of certain other seemingly innocuous things. You know, there's a fear of the idea of ending up pet sitting for people or officiating other people's weddings. You know, that's the stuff that scares him in the world. And so what did things like that, like his fears in the world, you know, tell you about him?
Well, absolutely. I mean, he fears mediocrity. He wants to be celebrated. He wants to be lauded above everybody. And he thinks he's going to be, because he's this cool older guy on this quest with a bunch of kids. And he's not expecting them to be, you know, capable and to fight alongside him. And that's really such a lovely thing about his journey and the closeness he gets. And, you know, those first 2 episodes, he's an absolute bastard to Kit. Like, he's got crucial information about her father and that's also the audience as well. You know, he's got this information that everyone wants to know where Val Kilmer is. And he's just teasing it to her because he thinks he's superior. So he's kind of a bit of a villain in a sense. You know, he's a lot more flawed and a lot more selfish, I think, than most rogues that you get. You know, most rogues are just sort of selfish, but he's can be quite taunting. And I think what I did is I countered some of those nastier moments of his personality by being playful. And I think this is like me as a person. I'm a quite playful, joyous person. So with Boorman, I was like, how am I going to get away with saying these things like, I know where your father is, I'm not going to tell you where he is now. And you know, that's harsh. And I was like, well, I'll just make everything he does fun. And so you sort of blindsided a little bit. And that's due to some of John's amazing writing. Like when that scene with Kit and him walking with the horses starts, you don't know that where he's going is, I know your father. You think he's just talking more nonsense and he's just banter again, as always. So it was trying to make everything playful to those nuggets dropped. And then you're like, oh, damn, he's not nice. Yeah.
And I also wanted to ask about working with Stephen Wolfman, who was the director of essentially like the first section of block shooting that you were doing, because again, going back to that boot camp, he was also involved in a part of that, which you don't always have that opportunity when you're doing television to spend that much time with directors, because often it's switched out. It's a new director every episode. And so it's very much focused on the showrunner being there through any rehearsals beforehand. And so what was the difference that made for you in having that really close dynamic that you were able to build with him before you even started shooting together?
It was great. I mean, John and Stephen were both there during the rehearsal periods. If John could be, sometimes he'd be writing, but you know, the way I see it, and I don't know if it's the same with every project, but the way I see it is the directors are in charge of the sort of, you know, the visual spectacle and getting their actors to do what they want to do and crafting those things. But the showrunner is the guardian of our characters. And so there's this symbiosis that occurs where a director is like, let's try this. And the showrunner might step in and say, well, we could, but also know that in this iteration or in the future, you're going to go down this direction. So just think about how that's going to affect you. And so having Stephen there was amazing because I don't know if you know, but I come from a technical background. Actually, I studied production design as an undergrad, and I was a production designer. Then I became an editor. Then I became a director, and I was a director for a long time. So I have a huge technical knowledge of the film set, which makes up for my lack of dramatic training. And I think the performative element of acting has always been in me. But because of that, I find it impossible to approach anything without some sort of technical, approach. You know, I find it hard to sort of step into a role without thinking about the technical aspects of it as well. So having a director to work with in rehearsals meant that I could think about it in a cinematic way as well. So one of my first scenes in the show, that also the first scene I ever shot, was myself and Joanne, me in the prison. And it's kind of a standalone scene really from the rest of Bournemouth because he's in a different place there. He's been in prison for a long time and he's quite dark and he's cutting, but he's not giving that much away. And you're like, who is this guy? And then the next time you see him, he's like, hey, I'm out. I'm having a good time. So I got to discuss a lot of that movement and figure out how I was going to perform that technically, knowing what the scene required. And rather than turning up on set on the day and having to block it and figure out the limitations of a performance, I was able to walk around the sets with Stephen and be like, this is where you're going to be shooting that scene. And so even though I didn't get that in later episodes, just being comfortable enough to know how I could use my sets and what cameras were going to be doing. I was also really lucky. I worked with Philippa Lowthorpe, who did block 3 on the 3rd day, and I'd briefly worked with Jamie Charles in a episode of His Dark Materials, which sadly never got finished because of COVID. So I'd worked with all the directors that were coming, so I felt comfortable knowing their style. But yeah, that first block was just, joyous. We would sit down and we'd rehearse scenes over again until they were like a play, till they were exactly what we wanted them to be, and block them out. And then when you turn up on set, it's just quick because you know what you're doing.
And with the character of Borman as well, throughout the arc that you've kind of crafted for him throughout the season, it feels like he's gradually becoming a little bit more self-aware and self-reflective, because he's starting to mirror some of the more empathetic aspects of the characters around him and take on little pieces of them. And so what were some of the important choices for you to make as you progress throughout the season to be able to create this very gradual shift in him, while making sure that you still foundationally kept him true to who he was at the beginning?
This is coming out after the show's aired, right?
I think like episode 4, maybe 5.
Okay, so I don't know how much I can give away, but ultimately, Borman's in a troubled place when you meet him. He's been close to people, but he's very guarded, and so he's decided that who he is self-sufficient. And so the first 3 episodes, he's just on board because, Tony sums up, Graydon sums it up in a great way when he's talking to Alora about why she doubts herself, and he's like, I can't remember exactly what he says, but Jade sticks around because she believes, or Borman just wants to see what you want to do. That's, he's asking why these people are sticking around. It's totally accurate. It's exactly what it is. Borman's sticking around because he's going to get something out of this for himself. And so all I knew what to do was to just put him in this fray, know that any moment of physical action, he was going to relish in it because he loves doing it. For the most part, he was going to hold his plans and his superiority and his sort of machinations, his Iago Machiavellian style. He was going to retain that within him and treat all that dialogue like that. But then I knew that there was going to be a point where he starts to care for these people that he's with, and that starts to happen around 5 and 6. And from that, it was just a straight shot home, because when I knew that turn was coming, it works in sort of perfect synergy with the plot of him understanding. And it's kind of what everyone is doing in the show. Everyone in the show is trying to figure out their place in the world. And Borman thinks his place is at the top of the pile with the sword, with, magical armor and all these things. And he's going to live that, because who doesn't believe that they're going to achieve that? And when he learns that actually that might not be his role in life, but what he could be is equally as satisfying, he finds solace in that. And he and that's the arc he goes on. And so, yeah, I don't know. It's kind of like one of those things that you, like I say, I sort of let those stories percolate through me, and then don't try and overthink it, and really take my inspiration from the words and what the words are going to let me do in a scene, and just sort of have these little bookmarks and know, like, okay, this scene he's going to be funny, but he's also going to give away a bit of information, but he's going to do it in a sort of Machiavellian way. And then in this scene, he's going to have a real emotional response here, and he's going to show that he actually has some empathy. So you sort of treat it scene by scene, but all these like characteristics are like stored up in your brain. Like once you start digesting everything, you're like, I'll just pick on that one for today and that one. I don't think I could have done any other job while shooting this, if I'm honest. Like, I was fully immersed in it. It's not method, but I was living in Wales. I barely went home. Came back to London. I didn't really do anything. I just went to the gym to stay big, and then went and acted as Borman. And then at home I ate chicken and rice. That was my life for 8 months. It's not a very glamorous job. Everyone thinks acting is the parties and the festivals and all the fun stuff. It's not. It's 8 months in a field in Wales.
And I absolutely love the intricacy of everything that's gone into every single moment that we see him on screen. And I'm so excited to see the rest of what you've created throughout the season. So thank you so much. This was so wonderful to hear all of these details.
It's lovely to be able to say them. One of the hardest days was the first week or so. We were doing this big scene in the Great Hall where the fights happened, they're trying to figure out the quest, and Bournemouth gets dragged in. And I just remember it being this humongous day, this ginormous set, every single lead character in one place apart from Warwick and Dempsey. But we had all these angles, all these bits of dialogue to cover, all of these shots to get. And you know, in terms of the technicality of how you shoot something, you do your master wides and then you come in for coverage and then you start figuring out your lines. And it's not just 3 people in a room, it's like 12 people in a room and endlessly changing angles. It was going to take forever. And Stephen came up to me, and I don't know why he assumed this, because I'm definitely not. I'm still the most green in some respects. But he was like, look, it's a big scene, but I'm probably going to do your coverage last. And I was like, oh, okay. He's like, yeah, no, I want everyone to have a chance, and I know you'll be able to take it. I was like, yeah, it's fine. I didn't really think about it. And as an actor, your job is to commit and give as much as you can on the day. Like, you can't just turn up and, you know, half perform when it's somebody else's close up and then spin around. Like, you need to give everything you're going to give from the beginning of the day, so that the people reacting to you, even if you're not on camera, can react the same way, because then you can upset an entire scene if you do it differently. Hadn't really thought about that though. We start at like 8 a.m, and you know, I think it's part of this has been cut from the scene because for time. But initially, I'm dragged in there, thrown to my knees, and like punched or something, and then dragged back up again, and then shouted at, and then I do this dialogue and I give it all of this. Yeah, and I basically did that about 150 times for the whole day until they got to my coverage at the end. And the hardest part about it was he had these like one-liners and these funny things that just stopped being funny before lunch. So by the end of the day, I had to do all these jokes and this comedy and somehow make it still funny. And so I think the haberdashery thing, which is like now one of my favorite bits, was just something I came up with on the spot. There were lots of different, there were just endless, like, you know, when she was like, I'll pardon your crimes, and he was like, and it could have been anything. It could have been even the one where I stole that laptop. It just kept going, I just kept doing endless ones. And the one they landed on was the haberdashery one. And it was just like one of those spur of the moment things. I was like, what's the most ridiculous thing you could be put in prison for? Stealing velvet. But yeah, it was born out of having to do the same thing over and over again. It was a very involved process.
I love that. Well, congratulations on the incredible reception to the show. And thank you so much for such a great conversation talking about this today. I so appreciate it.
Of course.